this module, we're going to condense a 4-hour presentation that we've given for a number of years and are continually required to update on the evolution of Middle Eastern terrorism and Middle Eastern terror groups. It's particularly relevant to us today because everyone's asking the question, why did Hamas attack Israel on October the 7th, 2023? And this particular module addresses that question in detailed terms, and we're going to give you a Cliff Notes version of that today. I've been asked numerous times to explain the background of the Hamas attack on October the 7th and what is the story of the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. And it's a very complex answer to that question. But first, let me give you a quick look at, in case you've forgotten, what that particular attack looked like on the morning of October 7th. It began at 6:30 in the morning when Hamas fired a barrage of about 2,500 or so Iranian-made rockets from Gaza at targets inside Israel. Now, those are not guided systems. They are fired in a general direction and they hit wherever it is they're going to hit. And I'd say another thing about this particular barrage. It was not meant to be particularly effective, but to basically distract the Israelis, the Israeli intelligence, and particularly the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF. The iron wall, which had been built for several $billion around Gaza, was attacked in at least 30 different locations, breached, and numerous Hamas terrorist operators streamed through those breaches. I have 1,500 here. The number has been upgraded to close to 3,000, and they went around it, they went through it, they went under it in paragliders, boats, motorcycles, bicycles, and some of them on foot. They attacked whatever was in their way. A music rave, a music concert, police stations, kibbutzes, people on the streets, people traveling in automobiles. Anyone they encountered, they attacked, killed if they could, certainly wounded, and took hostages as well. Both Hamas and the leadership in Israel have declared war on each other as a result of this particular attack, and the Israelis are pursuing it with tremendous force in Gaza right now. I am continuously upgrading the casualty counts. Upwards of 29,000 Palestinians have been killed to this point, 51,000 injured, and 1.9 million of the 2.3 or 4 million Palestinians that live in Gaza have been displaced, their homes destroyed. Israeli casualties, up to the point that I'm making this video, 1,116 dead. About 120 of those are IDF soldiers and officers that have been killed in combat since their response started on October the 7th. Initially, the numbers were 845 civilians, 350 troops, police, and security personnel were killed. 6,400 or so wounded, and Israeli men, women, and children were taken hostage. 80 or so have been returned at this particular point. This is a look at one of the breaches that they made in the iron wall with a caterpillar that knocked it down and allowed Palestinian fighters as well as a number of civilians to pass through the wall itself.
On the morning of October 7th, more than 1,000 fighters from Hamas broke through the 20-foot-high barrier that has long separated Israel from Gaza's civilians and the militants of Hamas. A $1 billion upgrade in 2021 outfitted the barrier with what Israel said were cutting-edge surveillance tools, a deep underground concrete layer to block Hamas tunnels, and remote-control machine guns above ground. Israeli officials hailed the new wall.
ומציבים קיר ברזל, בטון וסנסורים בינו לבין תושבי הדרום.
The surprise attack on October 7th was the deadliest single assault in Israel's history. So how and why did Israel's vaunted defences fail, allowing Hamas to pull off its shocking assault? To answer that question, the Washington Post analysed hundreds of videos and photos posted on social media, including visuals of the attack and the preparations that preceded it. We examined maps and planning documents recovered from slain Hamas fighters, reviewed videos and audio recorded by militants' body cams and Israeli security cameras, and spoke to witnesses. Our reconstruction shows how Hamas fighters quickly neutralized key parts of the so-called Iron Wall, exploiting vulnerabilities created by Israel's dependence on technology and remotely monitored surveillance equipment. Videos of militants training to attack mock-ups of Israeli compounds had been posted to social media months earlier and were visible to all. We took the visual evidence from October 7th and mapped it across southern Israel and inside the Gaza Strip. We used the position of the sun to estimate when key events occurred. We located footage from 14 breaches determining where they occurred, from the Erez crossing in the north to Kerem Shalom in the south. Israel says there were around 30 breaches in all. As fighters make their way to the fence, Hamas begins firing a barrage of rockets at targets across the barrier around 6:30 a.m. Israeli officials say more than 3,000 rockets were fired in total and were likely intended to distract their troops. Israelis are observing a week-long religious holiday. The country's military has recently been shifting troops to the West Bank amid growing unrest. After the initial rocket barrage, Hamas soon transitions to the next stage of the operation: sever the connections that link Israel's surveillance and security system. Inside the group, it is known as the Blinding Plan. Hamas videos capture attacks on at least 7 critical surveillance and weapons towers along the fence. How did Hamas know where to hit? Analysts said Hamas may have spent years collecting intelligence about Israel's defenses. The militants used drones to gather data and elicited information from Gazan day laborers who had permits to enter Israel for work. In this video from the day, an unmanned drone drops an explosive on one near Kibbutz Be'eri. Training videos recorded before the attack show fighters had practiced dropping explosives from inexpensive hexcopter drone models and launching fixed-wing Zuari suicide drones. Some of these towers house speed surveillance systems, which contain HD cameras, laser and infrared sensors, and radars, and can see people almost 6 miles away, according to the manufacturer. Each unit costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. In addition to taking out surveillance towers, Hamas launches attacks on multiple Sentry Tech towers topped with Samson weapons stations, which feature machine guns and sensors. The towers are positioned every few hundred yards along the barrier. Once the sensors send intruder alerts, IDF personnel can fire the 50 caliber machine guns at targets by remote control. Israeli forces have used the towers to kill people it said were Hamas terrorists in past incidents. But on October 7th, Hamas dropped incendiary explosives from drones, fired rocket-propelled grenades, and unleashed sniper fire at the towers, videos show. This tower, located beside a reservoir at the fence near Kfar Aza, was attacked twice by Hamas drones. Improvised incendiary explosive devices with fuses were dropped on its camera and beneath its weapon system. Video released by Israel shows that in at least one instance, observation soldiers were able to use a weapons tower to disrupt a dozen or so Hamas fighters approaching the fence near Kisufim.
All right, so that's what we're dealing with today in the Middle East and for the foreseeable future. But what's a historical background that relates to this sort of animus between Muslims and Israelis, between Palestinians and Israelis in that part of the world? The bottom line is there are no simple answers. This conflict has been going on for more than a century, and we'll look at some of the answers to the questions cited by experts as we move through our presentation today. Very complex. The situation is continuing to evolve. It's, in one sense, a crisis among the collective Arab memory of an earlier golden age of empire and their extreme anger in the fact that it has virtually disappeared from the world. It was a big deal at one point, from southern France on through major portions of India. The Arab empire of the 7th and 8th century controlled a wide swath of the civilized world. It was only in battles in southern France and in and around Vienna, Austria, that they were in fact turned back, and Europe in its entirety did not fall. Other things, though, are part of the problem as well. There's been a long legacy of colonialism in that part of the world. We'll look at what happened in World War I in just a moment. Lots of broken promises, and geography itself has an impact on making that part of the world very significant to the rest of the world. The Suez Canal, for instance, is constructed and makes passage around all of Africa no longer necessary. Geology that finds oil in that region has created a wide disparity between the wealthy and the very poor, and not a lot of people in the middle. So oil is, again, another one of the answers to the problem itself. Beyond that, there have been numerous battlefield victories by the Israelis against combined Arab armies that vastly outnumbered them. There's been 2 confrontations with Iraq, with Saddam Hussein. There's been a war against ISIS, the destruction of ISIS's caliphate that controlled major portions of Syria and Iraq. Then there's Hamas today, and its defeat is almost assured, and that will have an impact as well on the animus between the various parties in that troubled region of the world. All right, so let's look at the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. 100 years of tolerance, hate, conflict, war, and terror are as good as any way to describe it. I would recommend you look at a course done by the Great Courses on the United States and Middle Eastern history, 1914 to 1911, because that'll help you understand some of the things that we're going to talk about in the next few minutes. These are a number of events that in the 4-hour course we spend some time on that relate to the central question, and that's the evolution of terrorism and terrorist groups in the Middle East. Starting with, these are major events, the attack on the Munich Olympics in 1972 by Black September, a PLO offshoot organization which changed the face of how we do security at major events in the world. Before 1972, there were no SWAT teams. There was no Delta Force. There was no GSG-9. There was no hostage negotiation. There were no police snipers. All of that is an outgrowth of the lessons learned from the Munich Olympics in 1972. 2 events in 1979 that are hugely important. The power takeover, deposing of the Shah of Iran and the takeover by Ayatollah Khomeini, and then later in 79, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and 10 years following that, 1989, their defeat and withdrawal. Both of those I'll talk a little bit about in this shortened module. October 1993, the Black Hawk Down incident in Mogadishu. September the 11th, 2001, don't have to say any more about 9/11 than just mention it to you. October the 2nd, the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and the 20-plus year occupation of that country, trying to win the hearts and minds and do some nation building that ended with a tremendous defeat of the coalition forces, not on the battlefield, but in their inability to prevent the resurgence of the Taliban. The 20 March invasion of Iraq, using erroneous intelligence that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, which he never did, as a justification for that very bad decision. The Arab Spring, which lasted about 2 years and started in 2010, and then finally this most recent October 7th attack by Hamas. You can see by this slide that the problems in the Middle East are as a result of great powers, competitions, and treaties and agreements. Over 100 years ago, the Sykes-Picot Treaty during World War I divided up that part of the world between the British and the French. And it's literally true that these divisions were made without any understanding of the peoples on the ground, of the families, of the tribes, of the clans. And so they typically crossed areas that split apart tribes. And one half of a tribe or a quarter of a tribe would be in the French zone, another would be in the British zone. Not a good way to deal with the realities on the ground. The second of the 2 major diplomatic initiatives would be the Balfour Declaration. It comes in November of 1917, about a year or so after the Sykes-Picot Treaty. It basically is an effort by the British government to make Zionists in the United Kingdom and elsewhere in the world happy by saying that they look favorably on the establishment of a home for the Jewish people in the Palestinian Mandate, which they control. They try to have it both ways by saying that the establishment of that particular entity is not going to be allowed to affect or prejudice the rights of peoples that are already existing in that particular part of the world, either their civil or religious rights. And so this sets the stage for what is going to be a series of, first, rather smallish, but eventually rather large immigration into the Palestinian Mandate by Jews, primarily Jews from Russia, driven by, first, a series of different programs carried out under the authority of, if not the direct orders of, the Tsar's government. Jewish settlements, primarily in the Vale or the Ukrainian part of what was the Russian Empire at the time, are going to be attacked by the police, by Cossack troops, and this is going to cause them to do what's necessary to leave the area. At the beginning of 1800, there were 5,000 Jews living in the Palestinian Mandate. By 1880, there were 25,000. The number didn't grow that much in the 80 years, but it's about to grow an awful lot. And the first Aliyah, which occurred between 1882 and 1904, 20 to 30,000 Jews are going to leave Russia and eventually make their way to Palestine. Most of them are going to die. They didn't get access to very good land, and there was disease, the work was harsh and hard, and so most of them are not going to survive. The second Aliyah was by far the biggest one, from 1904 to 1914 to the beginning of World War I, when that's going to stop. And in this particular massive exodus from Russia, there's going to be about 2.5 million Jews leaving. Most of them are going to come to the United States, but between 20 and 40,000 are going to make their way to Palestine. Now, this group, the second Aliyah, is going to survive in Palestine and be there throughout the early part of the century, throughout World War I, and be a part of what the Balfour Declaration says is going to be a homeland for the Jews. By 1920, only 10% of the population is Jewish, 90% Palestinian. That number jumps up dramatically to 31% by 1936, and the Arabs don't like it at all, and they revolt. The revolt in Palestine causes a second look at the British position. This is called the White Paper of 1939, and it says basically three things. One, we're going to reduce Jewish immigration. Eventually, we're going to stop it completely, and we're going to reduce land sales to the Zionists inside the Palestinian Mandate. All of this to placate the Arab population. All of this is right before the beginning of World War II and right in the middle of the Holocaust that the Germans were perpetrating on Jews in first Germany, but then in the occupied areas that they annexed: Austria, the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, and finally Poland. If you look at the population from earliest biblical times, when the Jews and King David and King Solomon's kingdoms existed, the Jewish population in Palestine was dramatically reduced. That's all about to change. The numbers in 1939, about a third of it is Jewish and 2/3 of it is Palestinian or Arab. World War II is over. The British are being ravaged by movements on the part of Jewish terror groups to get them to agree to a Jewish nation in Palestine. They're being attacked inside the Palestinian Mandate as well as other parts of the Middle East and the Mediterranean. The British basically have run out of money as a result of World War II. Their empire is in a state of tremendous downsizing, and they throw up their hands and say to the United States, and here, you figure it out. We can't deal with this any longer. The UN looks at it, studies it, comes up with a plan to divide Palestine into two states. The Palestinians are given about 43% of the best land in Palestine. and I'll show you that on a slide. And 57% of the more marginal to really desert land in the Negev are given to the Zionists. The Palestinians do not agree. They reject the plan completely. They say that even though we got the best lands, we've got many more people. We should have the whole thing. And this particular plan is going to cause the relocation of massive numbers of people from that land you're given to the Jews and from the land that you're giving to other parts of the country, much like the British decision to leave India and create a Pakistan and India, allowing the Muslims to set up government in Pakistan and the Hindus in India. Tremendous relocations of the population are going to occur. This is the UN Partition Plan. You can see the two sides are given portions of the country, and the plan itself was based upon populations at the time where the vast majority of the Jewish and the Palestinian settlements were located. And you can see that as a two-state plan, it's a pretty cut-up map. And again, notice that the largest part of the land given to the Zionists is the Negev Desert, which holds little possibility for agriculture and for many other things as well. The State of Israel is born pretty closely after that. The Zionists in Palestine declare on May the 14th the State of Israel. 11 minutes after they declare their independence, President Truman of the United States recognized them. And on that same day, the armies of Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt attacked the new Jewish state from all sides and lose decisively the first Arab-Israeli war. And that's going to be a trend that you're going to see as we go along. As a result of that war, the state that they were originally given expands dramatically, and it becomes much less of a cut-up of various parts of the Palestinian mandate. You can see, much like the situation that exists on the ground today, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank of the Jordan River, the so-called West Bank, are the only things that are left to the Palestinians after the first Arab-Israeli war, which I remind you again, they started. And I'll also say to you that they would accept without question, as quickly as they could, the original United Nations proposal if they could get that today. Not going to happen. The second major conflict between the neighboring armies on Israel's borders occurs in June of 1967. The 6 Days War was over almost before it started because the Israelis preemptively hit the air forces of Syria, Jordan, and Egypt and had total air superiority for the entire 6 days. Lots of troops deployed on both sides. The reality is that Israel is outnumbered about 2.5 to 1, but they've got interior lines of communications, can move their troops around much quicker than the Arab armies. You can see in terms of aircraft lost what the first hour and a half or so of the war meant to the combined Arab air forces. Tanks lost, again, another extraordinarily different picture. All of the hundreds of the Arab tanks, they didn't even count them, there were so many of them. And then dead. I think KIA, killed in action, is a good way to look at the numbers. Israel 987, Egypt 15,000, Jordan 696, Syria 2,500. Total of 18,000 killed in the Arab armies to just a little bit less than 1,000 for the Israeli Defense Forces. A remarkably complete victory. This will give you a sense of, after the 6 Day War, what kind of control Israel has. Basically, all of the Sinai, which will be negotiated and given back to Egypt, and the rest of the country belongs to them. There is a West Bank and there is Gaza, but they are controlling the populations there. And most important for them, for the first time since biblical times, they control Jerusalem, the capital of ancient Israel, and eventually, as it is today, the capital of the state of Israel. A couple of events that I've mentioned to you that are incredibly important because of their impact to us today. Terrorism is not the same following the coming to power of Ayatollah Khomeini and his Islamic government in Iran. Not just Iranian terrorists actions and asymmetric activities against us and the rest of the world. But also they began to train up surrogates who have been successful in attacking U.S. targets. The Carter administration refused to support the Shah. His government fell, and you now have an Islamic Republic of Iran. And very shortly after that, November of 1979, they attack, take over, and take hostage 52 Americans who are diplomats in our embassy in Tehran and keep them for the next 444 days. The second event, same year, is the invasion of Afghanistan by Soviet troops to put a government in power that they wanted to be more favorable to them and act as a buffer to any sort of attacks from that direction toward the Soviet Union. And more importantly, they defeat and withdrawal 10 years later, which says to the Muslim world, and the rest of the world as well, that a superpower can be defeated by Muslims. A huge, emboldening event for Muslims around the world. The Party of God, Hezbollah, who is in power today, comes to power in 1982 following an Israeli invasion of Lebanon. It is made up of Shia, the same smaller religious sect within Islam that is in power in Iran. They have become proxies of Iran and follow Khomeini's ideology of hatred toward the West. The goals of Hezbollah are, first of all, like Hamas, although I hasten to add here that Hezbollah is a Shia sect within Islam, and Hamas is from the larger, much larger majority Sunni sect inside Islam. And generally they don't like each other very much, but when it comes to Israel, they are more than willing to work together. Anyway, eradication of Israel and Western colonialism in the Middle East, but Israel is the big goal. Bring to justice the phalangists that attacked and massacred so many Palestinians during the 1982 war in Lebanon, and to establish an Islamic government in Lebanon like Iran, which they're well on their way to doing. Before 9/11, Hezbollah had killed more Americans than any other terrorist group in the world. They were a significant threat to us, and only have been overshadowed by al-Qaeda and the attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, that killed a little bit over 3,000 Americans. That is another one of the major events that we want to look at that impacts how people around the world, particularly in the Middle East, see terrorism and the conflicts between the West and the United States and Muslims in the Middle East. Fourth event is the U.S. invasion, along with a coalition force of Afghanistan and the 20-year occupation. When you look at this, it gives Osama bin Laden the opportunity to say, I told you so. These crusaders are against Muslims, and here they are attacking yet another Muslim country. And the 20-year occupation that followed, with an expenditure of tremendous levels of human resources and time and effort and money, with no positive result. In the end, after almost 20 years, the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan in August of 2021, and the Taliban came back into control. The fifth event that affects terrorism today is the invasion of Iraq that should never have happened. One of the biggest, in my view, the biggest mistake the United States has made in the last 100 years, and that's the invasion of Iraq based upon this idea that somehow Saddam Hussein was connected to the attacks on 9/11, and more importantly, he had weapons of mass destruction. There was cooked intelligence that said weapons of mass destruction existed in Iraq. Once we raided the place, attacked the place, and carried out significant investigations, we found none. And I think as importantly as that, we came up with a program to throw all of the administration of the government in Iraq out because they were Baathists, members of the party that Saddam Hussein was the head of. If you'd been a member of that party, you could no longer be in government, and that was all their expertise. Also related to the military. And there were all these people out of work and were ripe for recruitment by the terrorist group that eventually became known as ISIS. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you look at Iraq, Iraq is another one of these countries with a vast Shia minority and leans toward Iran. The Sunnis in Iraq are only about 30%. with the Shia making up 70% of the population. They were not in power and were held down, kept down by Saddam Hussein. But once he left and we installed free and open elections, they got elected, and they have since been much closer to Iraq, to our ultimate disadvantage. We withdrew our troops in 2011, saying that we had done everything we came there to do, which in the vacuum allowed ISIS to rise up, form the caliphate that extended across the border to both Iraq and Syria, and required us to go back in and with the Kurds began a military operation to basically destroy ISIS. We didn't do that, but we certainly destroyed the caliphate. The sixth event that I know you remember, but you probably don't have enough information to understand it very well, is the Arab Spring. It starts in Tunisia when a street vendor by the name of Mohammed Bouazizi immolated himself because he couldn't get the government to give him a permit to keep operating his vegetable stand. That immolation and the story on social media that accompanied it caused protests to erupt all over northern Africa into the Middle East. And governments began falling: Morocco, Libya, Egypt, Yemen, and a civil war broke out in Syria, and Bashar al-Assad's government almost fell. In the beginning of the Arab Spring, the terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the others in the area, were not prepared, just like the rest of the world was unprepared, and did not quickly take advantage of opportunities for them. But that didn't last very long. And the Arab Spring itself didn't last very long either, a little bit less than 2 years. But out of the Arab Spring, it spawned the civil war in Syria and the rise of ISIS as a result of that particular civil war, causing such extensive levels of unrest. When you look at the post-Arab Spring Middle East, there are a number of things that you can conclude. First of all, Libya and Muammar Gaddafi is gone. Libya is still in anarchy, sliding into more and more of an unsettled situation. The civil war in Yemen continues to take lives. Most recently, the Houthi rebels have been firing missiles and attacking ships off the coast of Yemen, causing some major shipping lines to stop using that particular route. Iraq continues to lean toward Iran because of that Shia population I mentioned to you. Turkey continues to oppose a Kurdish state, and our exit from Afghanistan was not orderly at all. It was an unmitigated disaster. And Saudi Arabia is very distressed about the U.S. reduction in presence in the Middle East as it relates to their own national security. And they're negotiating new alliances. One of them has been a covert alliance with Israel that has been put on hold as a result of Israel's response to the October 7th attacks. But expect that alliance to not go away. The Russians themselves, who had a huge presence in Syria, have reduced that dramatically because of their involvement in their losses in the Ukraine. And Iran is filling that particular void because they also are supporting the government of Bashar al-Assad, as the Russians did. As I look at the things we've talked about in this short time we've been together, I want to reiterate to you a couple of them. First of all, the story that I have laid out for you is very complicated, exceedingly complex. And even in our 4-hour module, it's difficult for us to get deep into that complexity. Both sides, both the Palestinians and the Jews, have legitimate claims to the land. They've both been there for centuries, and they both have excellent arguments. But solutions to the current conflict between them are highly unlikely because of a combination of years and years, decades, centuries even, of extraordinary hatred, of ignorance, of arrogance, lies that they've been told, and their inability to communicate effectively with each other, short of attacking each other. After this current war with Hamas is over, what do I see in the future? First thing I think I would say is Israel's probably going to turn north and attack Hezbollah and create a buffer zone because they're tired of being rocketed. And when they finish with Hamas, I would think that Hezbollah is going to be the next one on their list. As far as Iran is concerned, then they've got a decision to make. Do they want to help their surrogate or not? And one of the things they're worried about, just like Hezbollah is worried about, is the Israeli military. Neither one of them, Hezbollah or Iran, would like things to escalate, but I think they're going to. Saudi Arabia is a very pragmatic place. They've been supporting Hamas with money for years, but they recognize how powerful Israel is, not just their army, that can be a part of the national security of Saudi Arabia as they see the United States withdrawing from that part of the world, but more particularly their economy. Israel has a tremendous technological base and economic base, and Saudi Arabia wants to have closer economic and security ties with them. So while in the short term, Saudi Arabia is not going to continue their sub rosa diplomatic initiatives with Israel, I expect in the medium term that to begin again. Business, same thing. Short-term business and tourism is taking a huge hit. But in the medium term, because all of the nations in that part of the world are very pragmatic about their understanding that economic considerations outweigh religious arguments, they're going to want the things to get back to normal economically and business-wise as quickly as possible. The smaller terrorist entities, not so much. Hezbollah is not nearly as concerned with what's going on in the Gaza Strip right now as Hamas would like them to be. And I think that Hamas is going to be the ultimate loser. They're going to be around, but I don't think that they're going to be reelected again to be the government in Gaza, but we'll see. All right, that's it. That gives you a sense of what our 4-hour module on the evolution of Middle Eastern terrorist groups would look like. Thanks for listening.